Hello, my name is Ted Russell. I've been practicing law for more than 25 years, first at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, and then for 20 years in various senior roles at Fox. I currently run my own firm that operates across three verticals. The first is traditional legal work in the media and entertainment space. The second is investing in and advising companies in board roles. And the third is business consulting, in which I negotiate equity investments in commercial deals for corporations, institutional investors, and executives. Now, I have a fair amount of background in negotiation theory and practice, having taught graduate level courses in negotiation at UCLA, USC, and Pepperdine. I've also trained both executives and lawyers on how to negotiate more effectively. In this time, I've taken a particular interest academically in the intersection between negotiation and ethics, looking at whether specific negotiating tactics are ethical or appropriate. I've now taught semester-long courses on this, and along the way, it's never ceased to amaze me the kinds of tactics that people describe having seen at the negotiating table. At some point, I actually started cataloging all of these tactics and thinking about why people resort to them. The simple answer is they must be some kind of effective, or people wouldn't be using them. But that doesn't mean that they're ethical or appropriate. So for a long time, I've been thinking about the best way to tackle these tactics, what we're going to call today dirty tricks. And I think it needs to be broken down into two major parts. The first part, which we'll cover today, is what are dirty tricks and why do they work? Here, we'll introduce the key concepts. We'll give specific examples of the tricks, and we'll look at how they might sound in an actual negotiation. And we'll talk about some of the psychology behind the tricks and why they may be effective. The second part will deal with how we can recognize the dirty tricks when they're used. And here's the important part, how we can respond to them in negotiations. That would be part of a second program. So this is not an introductory talk about negotiation theory. This is an advanced talk about specific kinds of sharp tactics and dirty tricks that you may encounter in your negotiations. Let's get started by setting the table for the discussion. Now, perhaps some of this will be completely obvious, but we need to cover it to make sure that we're all working from the same page. Negotiation consists of communications among parties. That much is clear. And parties have to make choices about those communications. When you're a lawyer, it's a little complicated because you have an obligation to represent your client zealously. And that means that you're going to make choices about your communications that are designed to maximize your client's interests. Now, you're not just trying to reach a deal on the best terms. You're also trying to reach a deal that is durable. What I mean by that is that the other side will actually perform the deal. They won't try to get out of the performance based on something that you did in the negotiation. This could include claiming fraudulent inducement or seeking rescission or even potentially suing for fraud. Also, the client's interests need to be viewed more broadly than just the current deal that's under negotiation. Other interests they have, like their relationships and reputation, need to be considered when making choices about how to represent a client in a negotiation. So you may say, that all sounds great, but we've all encountered lawyers who don't play that way. These are people who treat negotiation like it's all a big game, often saying that it's like a game of poker where bluffing is completely allowed. Now, I've heard that analogy for years, and I have to say that I don't think it's a good one. In poker, there are clear rules. If one party bluffs and it works, the other parties know that this was part of the game. They may even appreciate how well someone has misled them. But in poker, if one party pulls a card out from under the table, that is clearly a violation of the rules. And there was a time when a person might be shot for using that tactic. So therein lies the problem with the analogy to poker. In negotiations, the rules are not generally known or accepted, making it difficult to decide whether specific tactics are or are not ethical or otherwise appropriate. Instead, the rules are conflicting and confusing. I've covered this in other programs dealing with negotiation ethics, but at a high level, some of the rules speak in absolute terms about using only such means as are consistent with the truth. But then there are ethics opinions that expressly allow a negotiating party to misrepresent its goals, misrepresent its bottom line negotiating position, and even to misrepresent its confidence in the availability of alternatives to reaching a deal. This is what you may understand as a BATNA, or best alternative to a negotiated agreement. You can take a look, for example, at ABA Ethics Opinion 06-439, although the rules in some states like California seem to be more restrictive. You can take a look in that regard at California Ethics Formal Opinion 2015-194. So there are clear cases at either end of the spectrum. Everyone knows you can't negotiate the sale of a car by misrepresenting the number on the odometer, as that goes right to the value of the item being negotiated. But on the other end of the spectrum, everyone knows that a lawyer might understate her client's willingness to settle a case. The problem, of course, is everything in between those two extremes. In other words, which tactics are more like permissible bluffing in poker, and which are more like pulling a card out from under the table? It's a difficult situation. We have lawyers who don't know or care about the rules because they think the likelihood of enforcement is low. We have rules that are conflicting and confusing in their own right. And we have a whole mix of lawyers, some of whom are scrupulously honest and others who are maybe not so much. All of this means that we have a real potential problem in terms of trusting the communications we receive from the other parties in negotiations. So why do people engage in these sharp tactics in the first place? As I said before, they must think that they're effective, or presumably they wouldn't be using them. But why are they effective? Some of that has to do with psychology. Psychology impacts how negotiating parties process and think about communications they receive in a negotiation. So I want to go through the psychology very briefly, because it turns out that the psychology is what is behind a lot of the reasons why these dirty tracks are being used and are effective. And here I want to give credit to those who did the heavy-duty academic research that uncovered these phenomena, starting with Professor Robert Cialdini and more recently Professor Noah Goldstein at UCLA. They've studied this area systematically, and they've identified the principles that influence and persuade others. And those same principles apply in negotiations. I'm going to run through these principles quickly because we will see later that they explain many of the dirty tricks in negotiation and why they may be effective, much as we wish that were not the case. The first principle is consistency. This refers to our need to maintain, at least in our own eyes, consistency in our words and actions. This means that people are drawn to meet commitments that they've made. So statements in negotiations are more persuasive when they point out that what they're asking of you is consistent with your prior commitments and actions. For example, someone calls you at home and they're seeking a donation to a charity that you supported in the past. They're very likely to lead with a statement like, "Thank you for being the kind of person who cares about the group that you're supporting." Now, why are they doing that? They're identifying your past behavior right before they ask you to take a new action, making a new donation, that is consistent with your past behavior. Problem is that people can use this consistency principle in a negative way, what we call consistency traps. For example, in a negotiation, they might try to get you to agree to an innocent-sounding proposition, something like, the price should be similar to comparable items. And then, of course, they spring on you the supposedly comparable items. Our desire to behave consistently can be exploited in this way. The second principle is reciprocity. Reciprocity refers to our feeling that we owe something to those who have done things for us. Some skilled negotiators, unfortunately, can exploit this social norm by trying to trade very small benefits for much larger ones. The third principle is liking. This refers to the tendency to favor people whom we like and who like us, and particularly people who share similar backgrounds, beliefs, interests, and who may identify with our same groups. Some skilled negotiators, unfortunately, can use this principle to ingratiate themselves to the other side in order to secure concessions. The fourth principle is authority. This refers to the tendency to believe and follow people who have expertise and whom we trust. Again, this is a principle that can be exploited by skilled negotiators, as we will see. The fifth principle is scarcity. This refers to the tendency to value things more when we think the supply may be running out. This could deal with the number of items left in a negotiation, or it could instead deal with a limited amount of time to make a deal. Again, some skilled negotiators can exploit this tendency by suggesting that the other party is at risk of losing the opportunity to close a deal. The sixth principle is called social proof. This refers to the tendency of people to take their cues from what others are doing. This is why people feel drawn, for example, to a restaurant that always seems to have a line. There is social proof at work because people think that all those people can't be wrong. Again, some negotiators can unfortunately exploit this principle by relying upon the actions or opinions of others to influence the party on the other side of the table, even suggesting that other parties in other negotiations have made comparable deals with them. These tendencies that we have are very ingrained, and we've all seen them at work in our lives. Think, for example, what's happening when one kid urges another kid to do something and says, all the cool kids are doing it. That is a classic attempt to exploit social proof. And note that the statement does not necessarily need to be true. It just needs to be potentially true to influence compliance. Another concept that often gets raised in the academic literature is perceptual contrast. This refers to the tendency to evaluate things by comparing them to what one has just seen or heard. Salespeople use this principle when they start talking about something very expensive, only to quickly pivot to something more reasonable. The second item seems more reasonable when it is compared to the more expensive first item. And negotiators do something similar when they start with extreme positions that they know will be rejected and then quickly pivot to something more moderate. The more moderate position, which may still be aggressive, seems more reasonable because it followed the first very extreme proposal. Okay, so we've talked about why some negotiators seek to bend the rules in negotiations, and we've talked about how much opportunity there is to do so, unfortunately. And we've briefly covered some of the psychology that influences parties to comply with requests made of them. What we're going to do next is go through and describe some specific examples of these dirty tricks. And I say dirty tricks, but keep in mind that what is a dirty trick to one person may be considered merely an aggressive negotiating tactic to someone else. That said, because there's so many tactics, I've attempted to divide them into some useful, broad categories, and that's how we'll go through these examples. I'll briefly describe the tactics, and then you'll see a short clip showing what that tactic might actually look like in a real negotiation. Remember, this program today is designed to introduce the tricks employees so that we can recognize them. I'll be doing another program that deals specifically with how to respond to these kinds of tactics, but we can't respond to something we don't recognize. We need to understand what those tactics are and what they look like. So let's take a look. We'll start with tactics that are more common and perhaps more likely to be viewed as merely aggressive. Let's start with tactics that are what I call setup tactics, because they happen at the beginning of a negotiation, but they can really impact the final outcome. One example is when a party publicly announces a position that locks itself in and reduces its flexibility.
Before we start, I should tell you that a press release is going out right now that says we're going to be launching our new product by the end of the year. So that means that whatever happens in this negotiation, one of the terms is going to be that the product we create has to be launched by the end of the year.
Another example is when a party makes a deal before the negotiation with a third party that somehow limits its flexibility.
You should know that we have another deal with a third party that is confidential, so I can't disclose it. But as part of that deal, we agreed with that other party that we would not give other parties some of the things you may be inclined to ask for in this negotiation. I'm just trying to be upfront about that.
Another example of a common tactic, which people may view as not just aggressive but a dirty trick, has to do with exploiting a power dynamic. So for example, setting the negotiation in a large building or in an office that's designed to intimidate. Another tactic deals with trying to impact the comfort level of the other side of the negotiation. So setting the negotiation for a very early hour after someone has traveled, or putting them in a space with less privacy, maybe having poor lighting, changing the temperature. These are all examples of tricks that have to do with the comfort of the other side.
No, sorry, we don't have a separate breakout room for you. You can step into the hallway if you need to talk. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, those chairs aren't the regular ones we usually keep in the conference room, but hopefully they're okay. I'll ask them to check on the air conditioning in there, but I'm pretty sure it's working.
Another example is asserting positions under the ruse that you're merely clarifying something. Let's look at that.
I'd like to just clarify something about your offer. When you say that you're giving us your best terms, I assume that you mean that your proposal includes a favored nations provision, right?
Another tactic, which is aggressive but not necessarily a dirty trick, is simply to insist upon concessions without giving anything in return.
I hear your request, but what am I getting in return? This process should be an exchange, right?
Another tactic is to demand unilateral concessions. Let's look at that.
Before we start, we need to get an agreement that any deal we do will include this ask of ours, right? I mean, that's sort of obvious, so I don't think we should have to be giving anything to get that basic understanding.
Another common tactic that we see in negotiation is the piecemeal negotiation, or what I call leapfrogging. Often this takes the form of saying, let's put a pin in that issue. Well, let's just come back to that issue. And the idea is that you're implying flexibility on that point, but you're not actually giving on that point. And in fact, later you're likely to take a firm position in the other direction.
Okay, turning the page here. The next issue is number 4. Look, I think we should just put a pin in that one and come back to it later. I think we're going to be able to work through that one.
Another common tactic, which is perhaps aggressive but not necessarily a dirty trick, is simply inviting the other side to bid against itself.
Wait, that's your offer? You're going to need to do better than that. Are you serious about that? Oh, come on. Try again.
Another tactic that we touched on when we talked about the perceptual contrast concept is to anchor your position very hard. And that simply means taking an extreme position, understanding that you're going to change quickly because you know that that first position is going to impact their perception of other later proposals. Another tactic is what we call the door in the face technique, which exploits this perceptual contrast phenomenon. In this one, you ask for a very large favor or a very large concession, and then you're more likely to have the small favor accepted.
We'd like to propose a price of $13 million because we feel it's fair, but in the interest of trying to cut through this, our proposal is $9.3 million.
The other tactic is what we call the foot in the door tactic, which is really trying to build momentum by getting a small concession that you can use to open up other concessions.
Why don't we start with the easy stuff? I mean, I assume there's something we can do on point 6, right? Let's just start with something super simple, then maybe we can come back later and see if we can do more on that point.
Another tactic that people think of probably more as a aggressive tactic, but not necessarily a dirty trick, is simply moving very slowly. Sometimes this is called creeping and reducing the size of those moves over time. Another tactic that we see is linking issues that may not be logically linked, but the other party thinks that there's some competitive advantage that they obtain by linking them. Another tactic we see that is somewhat aggressive, potentially could be considered a dirty trick, is what we call the bogey or the straw man or the decoy. And this involves exaggerating the importance of an issue that you don't really care that much about, but you know the other side cares about, and you're going to trade that away later and hopefully get some value for it.
I know we said we care about this issue, but I actually don't care about it at all. I'm just making a big deal about it so that we can get something good in return for caving on this one.
Another tactic that we see is sometimes referred to as scrambled eggs. And that just means that you make a proposal that really makes no sense. It's designed to confuse the other side and leave yourself a lot of flexibility later to claim that it meant something different than maybe the other side understood.
Great. So I think we'll be able to solve for that issue together with the other one. Sounds like if you're willing to be flexible, then we're just about done. I'll have my lawyers prepare the paperwork.
Another common tactic that we see is what I call the start over, or a golfer might call it a mulligan. And that's where they take a new person and insert them into the negotiation, and it essentially makes the other party have to start over building a relationship, and it gives you an opportunity to run away from some of the commitments or some of the implied commitments that you may have made earlier.
Before we get started on this session, which I hope is our last one, so we can wrap things up here, I would like to introduce you to my colleague. He's going to be taking over the negotiations from our side so I can tend to other important matters. I know we still have some open issues, but I'm sure you two can work through them.
The next tactic is what we'll call a simple divide and conquer. And that just means that you don't like the party that you're dealing with, so you do forum shopping. You do an end run around the party you're dealing with. I'd like to move now to a new category of dirty tricks that are all arguably in bad faith. I want to distinguish these from the prior tactics, which many people would view as merely aggressive. These tactics are much more certain to get a reaction that you're operating in bad faith. So the first one is the bait and switch, which is you get a commitment and then you simply walk things back.
I know we said earlier that we could agree on your proposal on issue 2, but I'm afraid I've checked and we can't do that after all.
The next tactic is simply going backwards. You're having a negotiation, you seem to be moving in the same direction, and suddenly the other side goes in the other direction.
I've discussed your proposal with my colleagues, and I'm afraid it did not go over very well. We're reducing our proposal from the last round in response.
Another tactic that's very simple, but arguably bad faith, is simply reneging on commitments that you've made. Reopening issues, broadening the issues in an unfair way, claiming amnesia or misunderstanding of what has happened earlier in the negotiation.
I'm sorry, but I have no recollection of that. You keep saying that we agreed to that, but I don't recall that we did.
A very common tactic, which is potentially bad faith, is what we call nibbling or add-ons. And this is when you think that you have a deal and the other side says, great, I'm glad we have a deal, but we have this one more thing. And there's always one more thing until the other party refuses to do that or starts adding on their own items of concern.
I'm glad we seem to be almost done. There's just one more thing we need to add to the pile, and then we're done.
I want to go next to another broad category of dirty tricks, which I'm going to refer to as basic deception about the subject of the negotiation.
I appreciate you offering to go our way on this issue, but frankly, that point isn't very valuable to us.
This can start with opinions or statements of fact about the value of the subject matter that's being negotiated.
Listen, I'm going to tell them that we had a private company do an analysis of the valuation of each issue, and then I'm going to tweak the numbers I tell them. They don't know this, but they think the items we're discussing are 5 years old, and they're actually 15 years old.
Another form that this takes is simply denying the truth of the other side's facts that they put forward.
I'm not sure where you got that information, but it's just wrong.
This can also take the form of overstating the strengths or underplaying the weaknesses in a case.
I've been practicing for 25 years, and I've never seen a stronger case.
The next category, broadly, is deception about the underlying interests in a negotiation. This can start with one party misrepresenting its strategy or its goals in the negotiation.
This isn't public yet, but our company's strategy is to focus on the first market, but not the second one we discussed.
Related to strategy and goals is when a party misrepresents its objectives or its priorities in a negotiation.
I'll be candid with you. Our priorities are to make a non-exclusive deal, as we don't care about being the only player in this market.
And lastly, a party can misrepresent its specific plans for the future. What are its intentions?
Our plan is to make the first type of product, not the second kind. We have no intentions of making the second kind.
The next broad category I'd like to discuss is deception about the actual position being taken in the negotiation. The first example of that is what I'll call the false bottom line, or a take it or leave it offer that's not truly take it or leave it.
This is the best we can do. It's our bottom line. And while I hate to say take it or leave it, this is definitely a take it or leave it offer.
Another example is making a false promise to the other side of some future concession when you know that there's no intention to grant that concession or to comply with the deal at a future time. That can also take the form of promising some kind of future benefits, either to the company or, more nefariously, a future benefit for the negotiator on the other side.
If you can be flexible, we can go our way on this issue. We're going to be flexible and go your way on some of your issues. Look, it doesn't matter whether we say we're giving in on this point, because we're never going to comply with that provision, no matter what it says in the contract.
It would be a very wise thing for you to agree to our proposal. We have lots of new initiatives coming up, and you would be in a great position to be our chosen partner if you are flexible in this deal and we can get it done on our terms.
Listen, can I talk to you privately? This is just between us. You're a very bright young person. I can recognize talent when I see it. I don't know whether your current company recognizes what they have in you, but when this deal is done, we would love to talk to you about a much bigger role at our company.
Another category is what I'll refer to as false restraints. And all of these take the form of, I wish I could give you this point, but I don't have any flexibility on it because fill in the blank. First example would be, we agreed to do that once, but it was a complete disaster. We call that the Hindenburg tactic.
Look, I know you really want us to move on this point, but it's not going to happen. I was here the last time we agreed to give on this point, and it turned into a disaster. So there's no way we're going to make that mistake a second time.
Another example is claiming that all of our other deals have it.
Look, I'll make this easy for you. We have to get this point included because we get it in all our deals. It's company policy that we cannot close any deals without it.
Or the opposite, none of our deals have that point that you want, so we can't give it to you.
We cannot give this point that you want because we never give it. It's company policy that we cannot close any deals with it.
One word of warning here is to beware what I call the Mr. Potato Head tactic. We all remember Mr. Potato Head. You could put the eyes from one deal, the glasses from another, the ears from another. And the idea here is that no single deal has each and all of the terms that the other side is claiming they want, but they're truthfully saying that they have other deals with those terms. Another tactic is claiming falsely that other deals have died when opponents have refused to give a point that the negotiator is asking for.
I know you feel strongly about winning this, but here's the deal. We've lost much bigger deals over this point when people said they could not give it. If we were willing to lose those much bigger deals, I assure you that we're willing to lose this one. You need to give us this point.
Or the converse could be saying that other deals have died when other people have insisted on getting a point that you're not going to give.
I know you feel strongly about winning this, but here's the deal. We've lost much bigger deals over this point when people insisted on getting it. If we were willing to lose those much bigger deals, I assure you that we're willing to lose this one. We cannot give you this point.
Another example is claiming that you can get the term that you're asking for, or you can avoid giving that term with your competitor, and they can always just go and do that deal instead.
You may wish to know that this point we're requesting, I know for a fact that we can get that if we make this deal with your competitor.
Another broad category of false claims is that it would somehow create business problems for the company if they were to grant the point. So this takes a few forms. It could be, for example, claiming that giving the point will trigger an MFN.
I'm not saying that your request on this point is unreasonable. What I'm saying is that I can't give it to you because we have a favored nations clause with another company and we would have to give it to them too. And that would cost us much more than this deal's worth. So we cannot give the point.
Or a most favored nation provision on another deal.
I understand why you want this point. I wish I could give it to you, but my hands are tied. If I give you this point, it would completely screw us up on another big deal. And I just can't do that. So we just cannot give on this point.
Claiming that it could hurt the relationship with a larger partner, for example.
You make a good point. But if I give you this point, it's going to get me into big trouble with one of our biggest partners. Sorry, but I just can't do it.
Another example is suggesting that agreeing to a particular term would preclude you from pivoting your business in the future in some very important way.
The ask you're making would lock me into a certain type of business. And with everything changing so fast, I can't agree to something that takes away all of my flexibility.
Another example would be claiming that there are legal reasons that preclude you from giving on a certain point. So it could be regulatory enforcement risk or a private lawsuit risk.
So I've talked about this request with my legal team and we just can't do it. They say way too much risk of being sued or investigated by the government, and we can't agree to put ourselves in that position. I can't get into the details of our conversation, as I'm sure you can understand.
Another tactic is to claim that you lack the resources to agree to their position. Maybe you lack the money to agree, or you lack the time.
You know what? Even if we wanted to, we couldn't afford to.
Sorry, but we just can't do that. There's just no way we have enough time to make it happen.
Another tactic is to suggest that there are some internal dynamics at play that you can't explain but are really limiting your flexibility. A different kind of tactic is what I'll broadly refer to as gaslighting, which is, I don't accept your position because it's not well-founded, even if it is potentially well-founded. For example, denying the validity of the other side's valid data.
Honestly, I don't know where you're getting that information from, but it's not consistent with our experience in this business.
Or relying on sketchy information or using incorrect assumptions, such as unrealistic supporting data to support your own position.
We've done a lot of checking on this to make sure we know the current market terms on deals like this. And we're very comfortable that we have current information. Obviously, we can't share our internal confidential analysis and work product.
Another example might be proposing inappropriate benchmarks that you think should guide the discussions, maybe making claims about the norms in this kind of a negotiation or about how it works in this particular kind of culture or geography in order to frame what the other side thinks is potentially on the table.
I'm not sure how they do things at your company, but in this territory, we do things differently.
Another dirty trick is hiding or burying positions. For example, what I call the mission accomplished tactic, which is you simply assume that the other side has agreed to your terms, or you potentially just treat silence as acceptance. Another dirty trick can be not sending a red line when you're exchanging drafts of an agreement to the other side. Slightly more nefarious is simply allowing the other side to have a completely incorrect understanding of what a particular term means. And sometimes people refer to this as building a landmine term into the deal that gives you some flexibility because the other side doesn't really understand what's meant by that term and you believe you have the better position on it. A particularly dirty trick is the accidental, quote unquote, insertion of terms into a document and using that as the draft that you send over. Even worse than that is sending an erroneous red line. Purposely erroneous, I mean, in that context. The next broad category I'd like to talk about is deception concerning the situation or the context. One example is the timing. So, for example, saying that we need to really rush for some reason.
We need to get this deal done right away, and if it's going to get done at all. We just don't have time to haggle over every little thing the way you're doing it right now.
The opposite example is that we really need to rush, but we hide that and pretend that we're not in any rush.
So you know, we're not in any hurry to make this deal. If it makes sense, we will do a deal. But we've got plenty of time, and we're not going to rush into anything.
Of course, we can also use time as a weapon by rushing the other side, by using arbitrary or fake deadlines.
We need your proposal by Monday morning, or we're going to have to end the negotiations.
A different version of that is simply delaying them and possibly making them chase us or trying to get better terms by delaying.
We have your proposal and we're working on a response. As you can imagine, these are very complicated issues and we want to make sure to give everything the serious attention it deserves. As of right now, I'm not sure when we'll be able to respond. I'll keep you posted though.
Potentially getting them overcommitted to a deal, maybe creating deal fatigue on the other side and wearing down their resistance. Or maybe we have no intention of making a deal at all and we're going to give them what we call a slow no that somehow prejudices the other side. Another form of deception has to do with what are the dynamics on our side. For example, claiming that there's a bad cop here on our side who won't be flexible on the point you want.
Look, between us, this is an issue that my boss is driving, and I'm not going to be able to get her off this issue. So I'm not going to be able to give on this point.
That could be a tough boss or another internal department or division that's flexing its muscle.
Let me share some of what's going on here. Between us, we have an internal department that has decided to weigh in on this deal, and they have drawn the line in the sand on this issue. So the group making this deal isn't going to be able to change that.
could be a third party like a partner or insurer who simply won't be flexible on that point.
I know you think this claim is worth more than we're offering, but we have to work through our insurance company, and it's like pulling teeth with them. And that's all they're willing to do, so we're sort of stuck.
Another example is providing a false narrative about what's going on behind the scenes on our side, telling them things like, I need to impress my boss.
Look, between us, I just inherited a new boss, and I need to do a good job on this to impress her. So I'm not going to give on this point because it would just make me look weaker than I want to look right now.
Or there's an internal conflict between people in my company with different interests.
I know you're frustrated about our not giving this point, but it's sort of stuck right now in an internal power struggle between two executives. It's above my pay grade, so I'm not going to be able to wrestle this free as part of this deal.
Claiming that you're sorry that the company's so dysfunctional or that there's something going on within the company that you can't talk about, but it's going to prevent us from giving you this point.
Look, can I tell you something between us? My company is totally dysfunctional on things like this. I agree with you that your ask on this issue is reasonable, but to get approval would require coordination across like 5 different groups, and they can't agree on anything. And it would take months. It's not your fault, but the way my company works just won't make it possible to give on this point.
I know this is going to be frustrating, but all I can tell you is that there's something going on over here at my company that is going to make it impossible for me to give on this point. Sorry, I can't say more. I'm just stuck on this one.
Another form of deception deals with the availability of alternatives, what we call the BATNA, or best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So these false claims sound like, I have others willing to make this deal. You could say that expressly.
I'm sure I don't need to tell you this, but I have other parties who would be happy to make this deal with me. If you keep playing with your food here, quibbling on all these points, I'll just go do the deals with other people. I just don't need this one.
Or you could employ another party to serve as a fake BATNA.
Get this, my college roommate is going to surface tomorrow with a competitive bid just to put some heat on the other side so they think we have a viable alternative.
Another tactic is simply implying that you have other alternatives. So the classic example of this is you go to a house that you are potentially interested in and you don't see anybody else who's at the house, but you see a sign-in sheet, and the sign-in sheet has 40 names on it, which implies there's a lot of interest. What you don't realize is that the sign-in sheet is for a different open house. So having that sheet there has implied that the other side has significant alternatives. Another more nefarious tactic, if that's possible, is what we call planting the seed. So this is where an opposing party writes a note upside down, but they know that it's going to be accidentally shared with the other side. Sometimes you'll see an email that is purportedly accidentally shared with the other side, but it's really quite intentional. Another tactic is to claim that you're running out of time, or I'm running out of time or items that I can give you. This employs the scarcity effect that we talked about earlier.
You should know that we're almost out of time to make this deal. I'm not giving you a deadline, but any day I'm going to get a call from management telling me to stop working on this and get going on other priorities.
You know that we're looking to do just a few of these kinds of deals, and we're about to close deals with others. I just don't want you to be surprised if you don't close this deal now and the others close first, because then we won't need this one.
The other tactic, of course, is to control the other side's perception of whether it has meaningful alternatives. So making statements that suggest that that's not the case.
I know you've said that you won't make this deal if you don't get your terms, but I'm not sure that I understand. It seems to me that you really need to do this deal because I'm not sure what your alternative is.
The next broad category that I want to deal with is what we're going to call personal manipulation. Let's start with strategic display of positive emotions toward the opponent. This exploits the principle of liking, and so that has to do with observing similarities in background, beliefs, values, attitudes, and interests.
You know, I like the way you do things. We're going to work really well together.
Did you say that you grew up in New York? Me too, which part? I can tell that you and I see this business in the same way. And I'll bet if we talked further, we'd see a lot of things the same way. You must be happy about your team winning last night. I'm actually a big fan of theirs. I've been for a long time.
This could also take the form of expressing sympathy.
I can tell you're in a really tough situation, and I'm sorry about that. Let's just try to work through things.
Another tactic is to express affiliation, talking about how you're going to collaborate as partners and you're going to form an alliance potentially against some third party.
We're both smart people, and I'm sure that if we put our minds to it, we're going to be able to figure out a smart deal.
The way I see it, you and I are on the same page when it comes to how we would like our industry to evolve. Neither of us wants to wake up in a world in which you know who is an 800-pound gorilla and eats our lunch.
The next tactic is simply showing respect, appreciation, and concern when maybe that's not actually felt.
Before we get started, I just want to say that I have the utmost respect for your company, and I've heard great things about you as well.
Another tactic is to actually seek sympathy. This is called the wounded dove tactic, where you claim to be in a difficult position and you ask them to help you.
Maybe I shouldn't be telling you this, but I'm in a really tough spot internally, so I'm hoping you can work with me a bit so that I can come out of this deal with a strong resolution for my company. I really need to deliver right now, and I hope you can help me out.
Another tactic is basic flattery. For example, seeking advice or telling them that they're doing a good job and representing their client very well.
Look, you know your side better than I do. What kind of proposal from us do you think would be well received and get us what we want in this deal?
Lastly, more nefariously, would be an attempt to actually co-opt the other side's negotiator. And what this does is it aligns the interests with the executives, but not necessarily the company.
You're clearly a smart executive. I don't know whether your company appreciates you as much as they should, but when this negotiation is over, we should talk about whether you might be interested in moving into a bigger role over at our shop.
The next category of tactics would be strategic displays of negative emotions toward the opponent. These are things like showing disrespect or disliking. For example, someone might display disgust or surprise in reaction to a proposal. Another example would be simply exhibiting rude behavior that threatens the status of the other side. So keeping them waiting, interrupting, avoiding eye contact, using dismissive body language, ignoring them, or somehow freezing them out and giving them the silent treatment. Those are all examples of this disrespect. The point of the disrespect, of course, is that it can undermine the other side's confidence and potentially take them off of their game. The next tactic is simply acting in a patronizing manner. Showing a lack of appreciation, a lack of empathy, and not giving the other side any sense of being understood or valued for their role in the negotiation.
You keep telling me about some of the issues on your side, but honestly, I don't mean to sound rude, but I'm not sure that those things should be my problem. I have a long list of issues that I'm managing, and I can't take on yours too.
Let's just get down to the deal points because I've got a lot on my desk, and this isn't the most important thing I'm trying to get done today.
The next tactic is showing a lack of affiliation, a lack of any kind of problem-solving partnership.
I appreciate your enthusiasm to try to analyze every single problem to the nth degree, but some of these things are really simple, and we're going to resolve them pretty much the same way we do our other deals. So let's please just get through this.
Another tactic is asserting control in a very aggressive manner, acting like the opponent lacks autonomy or any meaningful choices or a real role to play in the negotiation.
Most of the points we're discussing are going to end up pretty much the way we say. We're a big player, and we don't need to haggle on these things, so let's just get going, and I can tell you what those things are. I'll let you know where we can even have a conversation about being flexible.
Another tactic we often see is using the element of shame or disappointment or somehow using guilt with the other party.
I'm not sure why you're acting this way. I've negotiated these kinds of deals for years, and everyone is usually very reasonable, but you're really behaving badly. Seems like you just don't trust me. Is that the case?
Unfortunately, everybody's seen another tactic, which is simple bullying or intimidation. So this can take the form of yelling or displaying anger.
Listen, enough is enough. I'm starting to get really pissed off here. Stop jerking around on this point and be reasonable.
It can also take the form of getting others who are not part of the negotiation to gang up on the opposing party. It can also take the form of simple ad hominem attacks, belittling, even mocking the appearance, their approach, or their intelligence. Unfortunately, we see that.
Have you ever done this before? I mean, you show up with these crazy ideas of what you think you should get, and then you act surprised when we can't. I can't tell if you're just too inexperienced to know better or whether you're just incompetent.
And lastly, a tactic where you simply impose on their physical space and make them feel uncomfortable to try to get them a little disoriented. Another broad category that I want to cover for dirty tricks is threats. And this happens all too often. So the first category of threat is to threaten some kind of action or retaliation in the course of this actual deal that's being negotiated.
I'll keep this simple. If we don't get this point, we're just going to stop working on this deal.
The next category is threatening to retaliate or hurt the other side beyond this deal. So this could deal with their position in the industry or their ability to make future deals or potentially publicity.
Do you really want to be known in this industry as a company that takes totally absurd positions and acts badly in negotiations?
If you don't give on this point, I'm going to recommend that my company stop doing any kind of business with you.
If you don't give on this major point, we're going to use all of our resources to tell anyone who would listen exactly what we think of your company.
Another threat could be to increase economic pressure by perhaps linking one particular deal to other deals that you have with them or other business.
I need you to agree on this point, or we're going to refuse to do that other deal we're working on with your colleagues in another group of your company. And I think you know that other deal is 10 times larger than this one.
A particularly nefarious type of trick is to threaten some kind of retaliation against the negotiator himself or herself. One example of that is threatening to or actually going to their boss to complain about their incompetence or their lack of good faith.
Hi there. I'm sorry to have to do this. Normally I would never go to someone's boss to complain about how they are negotiating, but what your person has done is very troubling. It's going to prevent us from getting the deal done if you continue to have her as your lead negotiator. Your current person doesn't seem to understand what we are trying to accomplish. She keeps making unproductive proposals and shows no creativity or flexibility to get a deal done. It's been a disaster. If you don't intervene or send someone new, this deal is going nowhere fast.
Another threat is to potentially embarrass or undermine their professional status, perhaps in an effort to try to get a new face at the table on the other side. And lastly, maybe even more nefariously, is to threaten their social networks by indicating that you share some of those same networks and could potentially harm them.
Didn't you say that you live in the same neighborhood? I thought so, and our kids go to this school together, so I'm sure we will be seeing a lot of each other beyond this negotiation. I bet we have tons of friends in common.
Another category I want to deal with is what I'm going to call espionage. And essentially, I use that term. I realize it may sound heavy-handed, but it's about stealing information and getting information that you're not rightfully entitled to. And I think most would agree that that's a dirty trick. So what forms does that take? Well, it could be simply going around the party on the other side to get to a colleague who's much more sympathetic, who's more likely to share information about what's going on the other side, including their willingness to be flexible on terms. Another example could be pretending to recruit a colleague who may have some information, claiming that you're interested in potentially hiring that person when all you're really trying to do is to get an edge. Another dirty trick would be engaging some third party to go get the information for you, exploiting some relationship or access that they have but should not be using. And lastly, simply ingratiating yourself to the opponent by using entertainment or gifts or other types of favors that are designed to create an environment where you can get more information. What we've just seen is a laundry list of different types of dirty tricks or tactics in negotiations that you may see on the other side. It's quite a long list, and that's simply because I've been recording them for quite some time and appreciating that they operate a little bit differently in each context. Remember, the purpose of today's program is to talk about the difference between dirty tricks and merely aggressive tactics, and how the rules are confusing and potentially conflicting, to talk a little bit about the psychology behind these tricks and why they may be effective. And lastly, to go through these tricks and give examples of them so that we can learn to recognize these tricks and spot them when they're used. We haven't yet talked about how to deal with them. That will be the subject of the next program, but we needed first to start with identifying the problems before we can talk about solving them. I hope you enjoyed today's program, and I hope that you'll also participate in the second one. Thank you very much.